Hey folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk about the Beatles all the time here. And this time out, we have a special guest, Doug Wolfberg. He is the author of this new book that just came out called Fab But True: Remarkable Stories Revealed on the Beatles. And I have really enjoyed reading this book. There are, I think I counted 16 stories here, which, depending upon your level of knowledge on the Beatles, there's bound to be something in here that perhaps you never knew before. But there are lesser known stories um, of something that happened in Beatle history. But Doug, welcome to Ken Michaels Radio.
Thank you, Ken. It's really great to be here. I appreciate you having me.
Let's start by just asking you the general question, what gave you the idea to do this book?
I've been a lifelong Beatles fan, and I knew the myth and the stories, I think, like every other hardcore fan.
Hmm.
But when the pandemic hit and, we were all in lockdown, I thought this is really a fine opportunity to really drill down on some of these stories and separate the fact from the myth.
Hmm.
So I'm a lawyer by training, not that that has anything to do with anything, but it tends to make me question things that I hear, and especially things that get repeated.
Hmm.
And I wanted to get back to the origins of these stories and really uncover some of the facts because they just keep getting told and told and told. And then that has a way of becoming fact. And I wanted to cut through a lot of the repetition and get back to the facts. And I was surprised at what I found in some of these cases.
Yeah, just what you mentioned there is a show to itself about myth busting. And as someone who, for the most part, not 100% of the time, tend to believe what the Beatles have said about their history, it also involves becoming familiar with their personalities and how they tell stories, whether they might stretch the truth or leave things out. I tend to believe the story as the Beatles have said it in most cases. Maybe we'll do another show on this. But yeah, I love this entire angle because, and it fascinates me that authors find new angles or parts of their history that really we didn't know too much about, like the book that came out a few years ago on Jimmy Nickel, The Beatle Who Vanished, and now
Right.
the new book from Ken Womack on Mal Evans. So, yeah, one of the things that I really love about your book is that, well, first of all, each chapter is fairly short, maybe 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 pages. And, for people who might think, I can't read, long chapters on some of these topics, if you have a short attention span, you manage to capture just about all the essential information that you need about that topic. It's a job well done right there.
Thank you.
And also, you have a postscript in every single one of these chapters so that all the people who are involved in this story, you tell us whether or not they're still alive, whether they passed away, what happened to them afterwards. And I really love the fact that you added that to each story.
Yeah, thank you. In some cases, some of the things that became of these people, there's such colorful characters, first of all, that I found in digging down in many of these stories, that some of which I didn't even know as a hardcore Beatle fan until I started applying myself to the research. But secondly, what became of some of these people
Hmm.
after their lives intersected with the Beatles, in some cases was just bizarre, mind blowing. The truth was stranger than any myths, quite
Hmm.
honestly, that I found. And those postscripts were interesting to write, and they really helped to wrap up the story that I tell in the main part of the chapter, in each chapter.
Yeah, for someone like myself, as I'm reading these stories and I'm wondering if these people are still alive, so I can approach them for an interview, and many of them sadly have passed on. But yeah, I really appreciate the fact that you put something extra in each story here with these
Thank you.
postscripts. Was it difficult for you to pick the stories itself? Or did you have more that you didn't include in this book?
Yes and yes. So I did. There's an abundance of stories, as you know, with the Beatles. I mean, any story is a rabbit hole, that you could go down. There were some that I didn't either have the time or the space to devote to. I mean, I'll give you an example. One is the odyssey of the publishing rights to the Lennon and McCartney compositions, right? Which involves Michael Jackson, it's Sony ATV, eventually some of the rights reverting to Paul McCartney. That to me is just a fascinating tale of highways and byways on how all of that evolved. And it all goes back to pieces of paper they signed when they were, 21 years old.
Right.
So that's an example of a story that didn't make it into the book, but maybe for the sequel.
Oh, is there going to be a sequel?
Well, I say that tongue in cheek. If there
Oh,
is a sequel, that would be a good one.
well, I'd certainly love to learn more about that. And one aspect of that that I could probably ask you is that aren't the laws, the copyright laws, different in different countries?
They are. Yeah, that's right. There's copyrights which revert to the authors after 50 years, but that's not true in all countries, right? So you may get your rights back in the United States, but not in the UK. So yes, that's right. That's publishing, and then of course there's what are called mechanical rights, which are the actual recordings and masters, which is a different story. So yeah, that whole Byzantine process of ownership of rights and publishing. In fact, at the very beginning, the Beatles kind of admitted they didn't know you could own the word, a song.
Hmm,
They just thought it was in the air for everybody.
right.
And in fact, Paul's been quoted as saying that. So that's an expression of sort of the naivete that they, and I think many young songwriters, maybe less so today, but certainly in the early 1960s, had as they entered the business.
And he sure learned his lesson, and he learned a lot from marrying into the Eastman family, where they were involved with acquiring music copyrights and publishing.
That's right. They were largely responsible for Paul's now billionaire status,
Hmm,
not only as a musician, but as an extremely savvy um, music publisher and business person.
right. All right. So I think what we'll do here is discuss some of the stories, but not all of them. You know, leave the people wanting more here. Some of the stories covered in the book, and I know one thing that I brought up through the years in my radio show, and I've come to really appreciate the importance of this, is the whole story behind the recording of How Do You Do It? Rather than me telling the story, why don't you? And then I'll question you a little bit on it.
Sure. I think the recording of How Do You Do It, and more importantly, the non-issuance of How Do You Do It as the Beatles' first single is really one of the pivotal moments in the Beatles story. And in fact, you'll hear some of the Beatles in archival interviews say that that was really a big moment for them. What happened was back in the day, right? Producers were the king. They controlled the kingdom. They had the keys to the record studio. They controlled what got pressed on vinyl, what got released. And their job pretty simply was to make money for the record companies. So they wanted tried and true hits, formulas, songs from songwriters that they knew, whose material was proven to be winners in the market. So publishers, a key part of their lives would be to go out and into the buildings in what were called Tin Pan Alley, the places where all the publishers had their offices,
Hmm,
and they would pitch the producers their songs. And if the producer bought the song and it was recorded and released, of course, the author of those songs and the owner of the copyrights would get the royalties. So that was kind of how it worked. Producers shopped for songs. They told the artists what to record. The artists were hired help who would record the songs. The record company would put them out. So that was the formula that George Martin applied soon after the Beatles were signed to EMI.
right.
And the song that George Martin found for the Beatles was this song called "How Do You Do It," or its long original title, which is "How Do You Do What You Do to Me," but it was shortened to "How Do You Do It." And it was written by a songwriter whose pen name was Mitch Murray. And Mitch went on in the postscript, we know, to become a very successful songwriter. But the Beatles were sort of instructed to learn this song, They kind of dutifully learned it, came up with an arrangement. It was recorded, but the Beatles themselves really said they didn't like it, right? They thought it was too white and too light because
Hmm.
their heroes were, Motown and black recording artists. Something had to have a little soul. So they presented, you know, "Love Me Do," which had a harmonica, which is a little bluesy.
Hmm.
You know, as George Martin said, not the greatest piece of songwriting in the world, but the Beatles wanted to stay true to themselves and they wanted to record their own material. And, they walked up the steps of Studio 2 in Abbey Road and sort of confronted George Martin and said, "We want to release our own song." And as I say in the book, that was an outsized stand taken by undersized artists, right? Because at the time they had no clout to throw around. But
Sure.
as a band, they stuck together with um, that stance that they wanted to record their own material. "Love Me Do" got to number 17. It did respectably well, but that started them on the course of recording their own material. And as we know, also in the postscript, "How Do You Do It?" The Beatles version did see the light of day on the Beatles anthology,
Hmm.
and was then given to Jerry and the Pacemakers, who did in fact have a number one hit with it. So George Martin his instincts were right that it was a hit song, but it wasn't for the Beatles. It wasn't right for them. And that was such a pivotal point in which they made a stand in favor of their own music. And in the book, I argue how you can sort of draw a straight line from that to the emergence of singer-songwriters who then really made a name for themselves by recording their own compositions. And, it ushered in a big part of that era and shifted some of the balance of power in the music business away from record companies and publishers and toward the artists themselves. So it was a big moment both for the Beatles and for the music business.
It says a lot about the Beatles that early, right at the start of their careers, after they were turned down by all the other record companies, that they took a stand on this. That took a lot of nerve in a way. And got to give credit to George Martin. It is kind of remarkable how everything worked out well in the end for all the parties involved. And just as a side note, I've said this a few times on my interviews here. Jerry Marsden did a similar thing with George Martin and Brian Epstein because after having the success of how do you do it and I like it, another Mitch Murray song,
Right.
they wanted another song like that. They wanted an up-tempo song, and Jerry Marsden said, "No, there's this song called You'll Never Walk Alone from Carousel." He wanted to have a ballad, and then they went with that, and it became a number one song. And Billy J. Kramer also stood up to George Martin and Brian Epstein because after Do You Want to Know a Secret and Bad to Me, they wanted, I think they wanted another Lennon McCartney song to be covered. And Billy J. Kramer wanted to do this song that he discovered called Little Children, which turned out to be a big hit for Billy. So here are these British artists at the beginning of their careers. At least Jerry and the Pacemakers had a couple of hits under their belt, and Billy J. Kramer did too. But this was the Beatles at the very beginning, before they even released anything with Parlophone. And they asked George Martin if they could do their own songs.
Yeah, it is amazing. And, when you think about that, all they had under their belts and on their resume was, the recordings with Tony Sheridan,
Yeah.
uh, in Germany, and essentially a failed Decca audition reel, right?
Hmm.
So their recorded work product at that point uh, did not suggest that they had that clout. And the other thing you said, which man, is such an important thing. I can't imagine how the Beatles story would have turned out if they would have had any producer other than George Martin, because he just was the kind of guy who wasn't threatened by, an artist who would take that kind of stand. He saw the personal charm that the Beatles had and liked their irreverent humor, and they all shared that. So it helped that they had those personality traits in common. But the fact that George Martin, who was so much older and more established, could respect the wisdom that these up and coming artists had, and the integrity that they took in the stand for their own music. I think a lot of people in George Martin's chair would not have been so open-minded toward these young, up and comers. And I just can't even imagine how the story would have turned out differently, but for George Martin.
Not only that, I know I've spoken to Mark Lewison about this, but he said that even after Love Me Do had charted, it was a respectable showing, number 17, but he still wanted How Do You Do It for the Beatles. And if it wasn't for the fact that they brought Please Please Me to him and they sped up the song, once he heard that, he thought, oh, we're going to go with this.
That's right. Yeah. And, and you can't blame George Martin at all, because as George had said in his own words, before they showed evidence of being these incredible songwriters, he needed material for them.
Hmm.
As they produced this evidence that they could write this material themselves, his trust in their instincts and in their own compositions, was magnified exponentially. So he had every reason to trust them at that point. But at this time, he didn't, right? So you can't blame him. He needed content. He needed some product. He needed songs that they could record and put out. So luckily, the next thing that they brought him was a hit.
Do you think, in your opinion, because very often I've heard the Beatles intentionally gave a lackluster performance for How Do You Do It, like they were trying to sabotage the song. Do you hear that when you listen to it?
Personally, I don't. I think there was some suggestion of that. I think Mitch Murray might have thought that initially. Interestingly, Mitch did not favor the harmonies that the Beatles brought to their arrangement, and which, of course, was a Beatles trademark. Later, of course, particularly when he reaped the royalties from the inclusion of the song on Anthology, came to see the wisdom of the Beatles arrangement. So, yeah, I think there were whispers that they sabotaged the song with their arrangement, but I don't believe it. First of all, I don't hear it. I think the arrangement is, um, it has gusto. I think it has some character to it.
Hmm.
And I think at the time they recorded it, they didn't know if they were going to win or lose the battle for their own material. So
Right.
they had to go into the recording studio thinking this might well be our first single. And, we have to make a go of it. So I don't think it was intentional sabotage.
Okay. In your chapter on How Do You Do It, I think that you mentioned that the Beatles and other artists who recorded their own material put an end or helped to put an end to Tin Pan Alley.
Yeah, that's the circle. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just because to me, we can debate this issue, but the Brill Building writers of the 60s to me are kind of like the equivalent of that. And they had so much success in the 60s with all the great teams, the Carole King and Jerry Goffins and Neil
Sure.
Sedaka's and Neil Diamond
Right.
and all those people,
Mhm.
you know. Did you think because that still continued throughout the 60s?
It did. And I don't mean to suggest that the composers who were just composers, many of whom weren't performers, who wrote songs to sell to
Hmm.
recording artists. I even to this day, that hasn't gone away. I'm not suggesting that they killed Tin Pan Alley, although I think that's the alliteration that I use in the chapter.
Hmm.
But I think it shifted largely the balance of not the balance of power, because I don't think artists became more powerful than record companies in the 60s, but the artists became significant forces in the music business in their own right
Hmm.
in the 1960s after the emergence of the singer-songwriter, not just the Beatles, but Dylan, and as the Stones began to compose, and which is another story from the book. Um, I think it helped raise the profile of the artist as not just hired help who, the producer would point to and say, strum your guitar when the red light goes on, to true contributors in the music, in the music business. It wasn't just publishers and producers. Now it was publishers, producers, and artists who became part of that equation.
Okay, agreed. But there's always going to be artists out there who are primarily singers that need the material and will search for it, and their management will. So,
Sure.
yeah.
Right.
All right, let's move on to another story here. Um, the three recordings made of Love Me Do with different drummers. And one of the things I loved about the Beatles anthology was to hear that recording of Pete Best drumming behind
Right.
Love Me Do, and to be somewhat disappointed in his drumming, actually. But, you know, I can understand what George Martin felt.
Yeah. So yeah, that's right. So when they did settle on recording "Love Me Do," it went through versions with three different drummers, right? It went through whether it's a demo or an actual recording session is a debate that I think is still had to this day. But when Pete was still in the band, so this would have been August 1962. Prior to that, I think the recording was in June or
Hmm.
July. Pete was dismissed in August. They did record a version of it, whether again as an artist test or as a demo, or whether they were trying to get a take. This version with Pete was recorded, didn't see the light of day, of course, also until Anthology. And that led George Martin to sort of suggest that they weren't, they could do whatever they want with the Beatles as a band when they would go out and perform. But in the studio, George decided he needed a studio session drummer to keep the time and lay down the solid foundation for the beat. So George had made arrangements to bring in Andy White. In the meantime, and contrary to popular belief, and sometimes Ringo even tells the story backwards, because you were saying at the beginning that, the Beatles, themselves tell the stories in different ways. And once you know their personalities,
Yeah.
you know where they embellish a little bit. But sometimes they actually get the story wrong themselves. Ringo always said, well, Andy didn't do such a great job that I couldn't copy it. Actually, Ringo recorded first.
Hmm.
So they showed up for a session. George Martin said, well, I don't really know who this is. They did record the takes, but Andy White was booked to come in for a subsequent session. So they re-recorded the sessions with Andy White. And interestingly, they released the version with Andy White, and the Ringo version didn't come out until a little bit later. So, and it's easy to spot the differences because, and I love the visual this, and I talk about this in my book, that one can almost picture Ringo, right? All five, six of them or whatever he is, just being forlorn when, they were showing up to EMI for a session and he finds a kit, somebody else's kit set up in Studio 2, and they hand him a tambourine and say, sorry, you can go hit the tambourine, but we've got this studio drummer.
Right.
And Ringo sort of positions himself. Back in those days, they recorded the drums with basically a single overhead microphone. So Ringo kind of positions himself as near as possible to this overhead mic and, and pounds this tambourine, almost to purposely try to drown out the drums. And you can so prominently hear that tambourine in the single mix of Love Me Do that it's unmistakable. And in the version that came out on subsequent, albums and stuff that Ringo played drums on, you don't hear that prominent tambourine because Ringo was busy playing the drums. And then the anthology version that came out with Pete Best, has a change in the beat pattern
Mm.
in the what they call the middle eight, that goes to something called a skip beat. It's a little late coming in, and the tempo changes a bit. So, those were signs that I think George Martin realized were, kind of planting these seeds of dissatisfaction.
Mm.
And I do think that that's one of the things that planted the seeds in the mind of the other three Beatles, that maybe it was time to make a change. I also want to say, having met Pete Best and
Hmm.
having had an incredible opportunity to actually play with him, Pete is a fine drummer, but he was not the ideal drummer for the Beatles. And I think, anybody who's been a musician, who's jammed with other people or played in a band, you have members of the band that click, and sometimes that don't click. Well,
Right.
for 2 years, Pete clicked, right? But they got to the point where, they needed the inventiveness, the solid time, the consistency, and other traits that, Ringo ultimately brought to the band. So I don't think that performance, that you can judge Pete's musical ability on that single performance. But when you see it and hear it, you can, as you said, see what George Martin might have been thinking when he said, "Let's take another crack at this."
Right. I've also had the chance to be friends with Pete for many years, and I've seen him perform, and he's a great drummer for a lot of the, basic 50s rock and roll that the Beatles were doing. It's questionable, we'll never know, if he could have ever have been as creative as Ringo was as the Beatles were progressing as a band. We'll never know because, you
Right.
know, he never went that far. So,
That's right. I've thought of that too. It's a great point you make. I could only imagine, how Pete would have approached, the drum part and Come Together, or
mm,
would he have done the marching beat and, and Get Back, or, the Ticket to Ride,
right.
pattern. Ringo is such an inventive player whose parts are composed. He's a compositional drummer, and those parts fit the song. And yeah, one does wonder if Pete would have brought those same, but he would have evolved too had he stayed a member of the Beatles.
Mm,
So it's interesting. Pete's a very nice man, and I think a good drummer. He just turns out he wasn't the right one for that band.
yeah. Here's a question that, well, hopefully you'll be able to answer because um, I've often wondered why the version of Love Me Do that became the hit here in the US was the one with Andy White. And if George Martin wasn't totally satisfied with the performance of Ringo on Let Me Do, why did that performance end up being the single in the UK?
I it's interesting. I mean, I think that whether whether there was a mix up or that got pressed, whatever the reason was. In fact, I think that master ended up getting erased or written over just so that wouldn't happen again. And in fact, subsequent pressings were taken from a first generation acetate, as I understand it, not from a tape master. So I think ultimately, whether that was an oversight or whatever happened, I think they ended up recording over or erasing the Ringo version of that master just so it couldn't be mastered again as a release.
Well, as we speak, with the new release of Now and Then, the flip side of the single is Love Me Do, and it's the one with Ringo on drums.
Right.
And when they just reissued, remixed also, the Red and the Blue collections, the version that's on the Red album is now the one with Ringo on it, when it was always Andy White.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's a great bookend to put the Beatles' last single with the Beatles' first single, and to keep true to the band, right? To
Hmm.
use the Ringo version. Again, I'm not sure about this. I think it was mastered from a first generation acetate, because I do think the originals, the masters to that on tape, were erased or copied over. But I don't. That's not one of the facts from my book. That's just something that I seem to recall from elsewhere.
All right. There's a story in here. I'm trying to remember if I ever knew about this. I think I might have known from Pete Best talking about it, or maybe it's in one of Pete Best's books. But the story about the racehorse that Mona Best bet on and what that led to, the fact that she made a lot of money on this bet, and you can explain this.
Yeah, so I first heard this story from Rory Best, who's Pete's half brother, when he was showing me around the Casbah in Liverpool. So, um, yeah, so Pete's mother Mona, who I wish I had met, I never had the privilege or the pleasure of having met her. From everything I've read and people that I've talked to, and accounts that I've seen over the years, was in a marriage with this Liverpool boxing promoter named Johnny Best, who was, you know, I guess you could say a bit of a domineering man. I could let the Best family speak to his personal traits, but you know, the accounts that I've read seem to suggest he was a bit domineering. And you know, Mona was from Madras, India, and you know, had come from some privilege, but you know, wasn't living in the style to which she was accustomed. Had her eye on this house in suburban Liverpool, wanted it, you know, very much. And her husband, you know, sort of said no. And sort of being this independent spirit, Mona Best hawked her jewelry, pawned it, and with the money, she went to the Epsom Derby and the English Derby and bet it all on the longest of long shots, right? This horse was the last in the field, or projected to be last in the field. And the horse's name was Never Say Die, which she picked just because she said she liked the name and thought it suited her, you know, sort of fit her spirit. And the horse was something like 33 to 1. I mean, it was the longest odds on the
Right.
field, on the track. Lo and behold, the horse wins, and it's jockeyed by a guy named Lester Piggott, who goes on to become a very renowned jockey in Great Britain with many wins during his career. And the horse, you know, so the bet pays handsomely. Mona, you know, reacquires her jewelry and has enough money to essentially buy this house with or without Johnny Best. So she buys this sort of big, really beautiful house in a suburb of Liverpool called West Derby.
Mhm.
And she decides that in the basement of this house, she wants to put a club. So her sons at the time, Rory and Pete, would have a place to go, and there wouldn't be alcohol served, but there would be bands that they could, you know, the teenagers could all gather, listen to the music, and they would serve coffee and espresso and things like that. So it's called the Casbah Coffee Club. And Rory sort of worked the coffee counter, and you know, teenagers would buy their memberships to the club, pink cards for girls and blue cards for boys,
Mhm.
and they would come and listen to bands. And for the opening night of the club, the Les Stewart Quartet was supposed to play. They broke up not long before that, but their guitarist George Harrison said, "Hey, I may have a group that can do this for you." And of course, that was the Quarrymen, which we all know became the Beatles. So I think we can draw a straight line from Mona Best's bet on this horse to this gig for the Quarrymen at the Casbah. And it was a time when, you know, any teenager who's ever been in a band thinks for even a fleeting second, gee, could I do this for a living? You know, could I skip college and you know, get into a group and try to become famous and successful? Or should I be sensible and go work in the factory or go to school or whatever it is? This was that point in time for the Beatles. Gigs were hard to come by, paying gigs even more so. And they had to make this decision. They were at this pivotal time. You know, they were all living at home. You know, you can imagine their parents, you know, post World War II, you know, come on, get a job. It's time to do something, right? And they were at this decisional point in their lives where they had to either be sensible, go to school or get jobs, or try this crazy idea of becoming professional musicians. And
Mhm.
getting that gig in the summer of 1959 from Mona at this Casbah club really helped keep the Beatles together at a time when they didn't have much going on. And I just think you can't separate that gig and that club from the crucial time that it was in their lives, you know, at such a young age. George was 16, and, you know, and having paid gigs to sort of keep at it, you know, stay on that treadmill. I just don't think we can overstate how important that was.
Yeah, timing plays such a big part in Beatle history. You know, I know Mark Lewison had written in Tune In that in 1961 and yeah, 61, the Beatles were getting really restless because even though they were getting more gigs and getting paid better, they weren't really getting further than Liverpool. And that's exactly when Brian Epstein entered the picture. So these things seem to happen at the right moment, thankfully for all of us. but this is another case of that.
Yeah, that's right. You can't get this kind of success the Beatles had without amazing talent, but you can't also get it without doses of luck
Yeah.
and opportunity and good timing. And all of those things aligned, for the Beatles to happen.
Mm. Okay. One of my favorite stories, which I'd like you to elaborate on in the book, is the whole story about the design on the Beatles' bass drum head. And it's a fascinating story. And you talk about two people, there's two people in this story who could have stood to have made a lot more money for what happened, what was designed on there. And why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so, in 1963, as the Beatles were really starting to take off, because it was the spring, so, things were really starting to happen. They were becoming more professional. They had Brian Epstein. Brian was, presenting them better visually in suits. They upgraded their instruments, right? They had these, Paul had the Hofner bass and George had his Gretsch and John had his Rickenbacker, and Ringo needed to upgrade his sort of beat up Premier drum kit
Hmm.
and went into a shop called Drum City in London, who was owned by a guy named Ivor Arbiter, who also owned other music stores and eventually became president of CBS in the UK and very well known. But at the time, he owned Drum City, and Ringo went in more to look for a color than a manufacturer, right? He didn't have a brand of drums in mind, but as he was looking at different colors, he found this, black oyster pearl, swatch that really sort of caught his eye. So Ringo kind of chose a color. Oh, that's a Ludwig color. Okay, then I'll take a set of Ludwig drums, right?
Hmm.
And because the name Ludwig, right, their logo was on their bass drum head, Brian Epstein, who had gone in with Ringo, sort of looked at this and thought, well, that's, a big advertisement for the drums and, for the company.
Hmm.
How about we get a little real estate on that drum for our band and promote them, more boldly than the name of the manufacturer? So sort of to compete with that name Ludwig on the top of the bass drum head, they said, well, how about, we do up a Beatles logo. And at this point, trying to sort of close the sale of this kit,
Hmm.
Ivor Arbiter gets a piece of paper, like right then and there, draws a big circle, and sketches out this logo with the big T and the drop, the drop T and the capital B,
Hmm.
the T that extends below the baseline of the text, right? And he sketched it out pretty much in that form right then and there on the spot. And there was a sign painter, a sign writer named Eddie Stokes, who was partially disabled, actually only had the use of one hand. The other was sort of what we call contracted. I'm a medical guy too, but so he couldn't use that hand. But on his lunch hour, from his work as a sign writer, sort of in an advertising business, Eddie would come into Drum City and would paint drum heads for Ivor Arbiter. So for the grand sum of £5, Eddie Stokes painted Ringo's original drum head, and then a few more actually, including the one that was used on the Ed Sullivan Show
Hmm.
in February of 1964. So the first, I think 5 drum heads were painted by Eddie Stokes for Ivor Arbiter, and Eddie only got his, whatever it was, five shillings or whatever the unit of payment was at the time for each drum head. And what I found out when I was researching this book is nobody bothered to copyright that logo, right, until the 1990s. So, I mean, if Ivor Arbiter would have just secured for himself the copyright for the logo that he designed, right, the royalties for the use of that image that would have come his way would have been mind-blowing. I mean, they would have
Yeah.
been staggering. But yeah, nobody thought to do that until 20 years or more after the Beatles had broken up, and it came to the attention of their company, Apple Corps, which then filed the appropriate trademark registrations to secure the copyrights for that logo. But Yeah, it was just drawn on the spot to close a deal to sell Ringo a drum kit.
Were there any artists, forgive me for not knowing this, who had their names on their drum heads prior to the Beatles?
So that was starting to become a thing. In fact, if you look at older pictures when Ringo was with Roy Storm and the Hurricanes, you'll see Ringo Starr on his drum head. He then shortened it to RS, which of course stood both for Ringo Starr and Rory Storm.
Hmm.
And but you could see Buddy Rich back in the day had a big BR on his drum head. So I think back then you would more often see the drummer's name on the drum head, and it became more of promoting the band as opposed to promoting the individual drummer
Hmm.
after Ringo started putting the Beatles on his drum head. But Ringo himself, right, would have his own name on drums prior to him joining the Beatles. I think there might be a few pictures of him still with the Beatles with the Ringo Starr on the drum head. And then there was a crude early logo that Paul had actually designed that had bug ears antenna coming out of the B, and that's called the bug logo. And that was just drawn on linen and then stretched across the drum head. And in some pictures, you can see the resolution and the color is sharp enough that you can actually see that strip of cloth
Hmm.
going across the drum head. It wasn't painted directly on the drum head. That way, drummers could, if they quit a band and went and joined another, right? It was very easy just to, well, off with that and on
Right.
with another. So it started really that trend of commercializing the band's name on the drum head. That's such valuable real estate. It made such a visual impact.
It's another thing the Beatles helped to revolutionize.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Whether they intended to or not,
They
just
did it.
was. But it's fascinating to me that Ivor, he could have lived off the royalties of this had he known.
In fact, the coaster for my cup of water here, right? I mean, it's on everything. It's such a ubiquitous, it's one of the most recognizable logos in all of commerce, and it was given away.
And even more interesting is that he just drew it on the spot without even thinking about it.
Yep. Drew it on the spot to sell a drum kit.
Incredible.
It's amazing.
All right, one other story I want to get to has a twist of irony to it. And this concerns what's believed to be the only painting that all four of them worked on together when they played at the Budokan, when they were in the Tokyo Hilton. And I think most fans have seen this painting called Images of a Woman. I say ironic because as we speak, it's about to be auctioned off. Christie's has a date of February the 1st where they're going to be selling this, and they're saying they're expecting between 400 and $600,000, which I actually think is not really that high an amount considering if this is the only painting that all four Beatles did, how unique that is. I wouldn't be surprised if it went to 1 million. But
I agree.
tell us the story all about this because it really is fascinating.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked this one because it's my personal favorite story from the book, actually.
Hmm.
So on the Beatles' final world tour, 1966, they go to Japan for the first and only time. And, there's just a whirlwind, right? There's typhoon and travel delays and, just so they finally get into Tokyo and there's a bit of an uproar, there's a kind of an upheaval. And you got to remember in Japan, they're 20 years, barely 20 years removed from the end of World War II. They're trying to rebuild the country's image. They're trying to take a seat at the table on the world stage. And, they're going to host Olympics. They're really coming back as a nation. And in 1966, they are booked to play Tokyo by a promoter who was Western educated and had a great understanding and connection to Western music, a Japanese born citizen named Tats Nagashima. And Tats had sort of learned the business by booking bands for USO clubs after World War II. So he knew Western music. He knew a big thing when he saw it. course, the Beatles were the biggest thing in the world at that time. So Tats entered into an arrangement with NEMS, Brian Epstein's company, to bring the Beatles to Tokyo. And it's the rainy season in Japan, so outdoor venues are out of the question. And really, the only venue that has the seating capacity for the expected crowds is the Budokan Arena. And the Budokan was built for the martial arts competition in the Tokyo Olympics,
Mm.
and it was built on a site that was sacred, that warriors would pledge their loyalty to the emperor before they went off to war. So it was considered to be a sacred site. So at the time, even though the president of Japan was what we would call liberal and sort of enlightened and a fan of Western culture, there were such strong conservative currents running through Japanese society that the idea of a Western pop band performing at the Budokan, which prior to then had only been for martial arts competitions and for Japanese music events, was just really sacrilegious, and it became a cultural flashpoint. So by the time the Beatles land in the summer of 1966, there are really, swirling protests going on in Tokyo, and for their own safety, I suppose, or just to prevent, the riots that could occur, the Beatles are kind of confined to their suite at the Tokyo Hilton. I mean, not a bad way to be confined. It's not like they were thrown in jail, but they weren't really allowed to go out and about, see the sights. A couple of them, snuck out for varying periods of time, but naughty Beatles, right? They were sort of caught, taken back to the suite. So for 3 days, the 3 days while they're there performing, usually 2 shows a day, they are confined to this suite, not much to do. So the promoter, this guy Tats Nagashima, brings them a canvas. Actually, it was a big paper canvas and some paints. And over the course of the 3 days, they start working on this painting, and it's a big enough canvas that each kind of takes one corner, right? The four of them, and they sit a table lamp right in the middle of the canvas so they can all have some light on what they're doing. They each take a section, a corner, and they just start doing their own thing, right? There's a common sort of orangish background, and then they all create their own, I guess you could say, abstract or impressionism
Mm.
pieces on the different corners of this canvas. And when they're done, got to do a visual display here. They lift up the lamp, and there's the perfectly formed white circle
Right.
that, where the lamp was, and they each sign their names adjacent to their contribution.
Yeah.
And yeah, this rather abstract piece is called Images of a Woman, and of course there are no images of any women anywhere discernible, as with most impressionism. But so that, painting, it's fascinating for a couple of reasons. One is because with this controversy and this melee and this protest swirling around them, they're kind of on lockdown. And to pass the time, they find a creative endeavor, right? Except in this case, it's visual art as opposed to music. And they seemed very serene and, engaged in this idea of doing this painting over the course of that 3 days. In fact, one of the photographers who was out on tour with them that summer on this leg of the tour, who was with them a lot, took the pictures that I have in the book of the painting while they're doing it,
Mm.
said they were almost obsessed, that they couldn't wait, to finish the show and get back to the hotel to begin working again on their painting, that it really just became this almost obsession. So I think it's just an amazing kind of sweet story about how they took refuge in just creativity, whether it was art, music, or anything else. They just found peace in it. Um, it was something they all enjoyed. John was a trained artist. The others were not slouches.
Yeah.
Paul and Ringo have both had their works exhibited. So it's pretty incredible in that it's a singular work of art. The four of them did a postcard to politely declined the invitation for Monterey Pop and later in the 60s.
Hmm.
But and then they all gathered, at least the three at the time, Paul, George, and John, to paint some of the walls and ceilings at the Casbah Club when Mona Best was getting that ready to open. Other than that, this is really the only known work of visual art that the four of them ever created. So it's singular in that respect. But just to me, the story about how it came about is I think just one of the coolest stories in the book. Another interesting fact that I found in my research, the protests that happened prior to the Beatles' arrival, that, over performing at the Budokan that led to them being locked down. There were four notable Japanese citizens who led these protests. One was the president of Japan, who later went on to win a Nobel Peace Prize, by the way. So not a bad guy, but because of these conservative
Hmm.
leanings in society had to sort of be a part of this protest. But quite duplicitously, one of the other protesters was Tats Nagashima, the very promoter who had booked the Beatles to play the Budokan. So he was sort of trying to bridge both sides of this divide between, you know, progressing with the culture in Japan by bringing the Beatles and then protesting the very concert he was promoting. So it was a very strange duality for this promoter.
Very interesting, that story, especially when you told me that the Beatles were obsessed with going back to their hotel room and working on this painting. The title, Images of a Woman, how did that come about? Did the Beatles really come up with that as a title?
As far as I know, they did. I am not certain. I did not find in my research how the title was bestowed. I did, I was able to uncover sort of how the painting was transferred and who came to own it and all that kind of stuff. But where the title came from, I don't know.
It's kind of interesting if you took a Beatle fan now and they're looking at this painting for the first time, how they would try to figure out which one is John, which is Paul, which is George, which is Ringo. Especially now that you have drawings from Paul, where you kind of get an idea of his style and also paintings of Paul, and Ringo has his computer art and all that. Um,
That's right. You can see their personalities and their styles once you get a little more acquainted with their other works of visual art. You can see some of John's, well-known uh, drawing and especially some of the things he did on the walls in the Casbah Club. So you can definitely see some of that influence in John's piece. And yeah, as you get to know Paul and Ringo's uh, published art as well, you can see their personalities in it.
yeah, all the artwork that John has done and the lithographs, and you get to see his style and his sense of humor and all that.
Right.
Uh,
That's right.
yeah,
I agree.
but this has been great, just talking about these stories, and just to give our viewers a little taste here of a few other things that you cover in here. John and Paul giving "I Want to Be Your Man" to the Rolling Stones. The story behind Eleanor Rigby, which may be a little bit more complicated than we know. Can't say for sure. Um, Interesting, the whole come together Morris Levy trial, which was covered this past year and last few years with Jay Bergen in his book. I've interviewed him for this channel and also on the Things We Said Today podcast that goes into detail about that trial. You know, since you are a lawyer, I'll bring this up to you because the one thing that makes no sense to me about that entire trial, it was a verbal agreement that John made with Morris Levy to cover three of his songs in the publishing catalog. There was never anything written down. And just based on what Morris was complaining about with Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me and Come Together, it's only a few words to a song that John was close to copying. It's not word for word exactly the same. And
That's right.
melodically, it is similar, but
Yeah.
it's only a few bars of that. So, did Morris Levy have any grounds really to sue John? It's only because of the fact that John was naive and just said, yeah, I'll cover three of your songs, that Morris took that upon himself to sue him.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, no, I don't think Morris Levy really had a case, but John didn't know that. John spent his money on lawyers after he got sued. If he'd have spent a few dollars on asking a lawyer that question before he got sued, he
Hmm.
would have probably told Morris Levy to pound sand. Now, Morris Levy is not the kind of guy one says pound sand to, so you would have said that a little bit more diplomatically. But legally, he probably would not have had a case under the fair use doctrine. In fact, that doctrine, which was what we call a common law doctrine at the time, just meaning it was created in case law,
Hmm.
became a statute. So it was codified. It was part of federal law that Congress adopted some years after that. So it was a pretty accepted um, uh, a permission, I guess you could say, that you could use a piece or something of another published work as fair use. A few lines in a song as an homage to an artist, for example, would by almost any stretch be permissible use of another artist's copyrighted material. So, in fact, Paul had advised John to change the rhythmic structure of the song a little bit too, just to give it a little bit more distance from "You Can't Catch Me." But the irony, as you point out, is I don't think any of this would have really happened had John asked a lawyer, just, hey, this guy's threatening to sue me. Does he have a case?
Yeah.
And that's what started the whole thing, right? That, you know, this alleged oral agreement that Mo Levy was given to release the Roots album, and then the alleged oral agreement to that John would record three, songs from Morris Levy's catalog, to make up for um, his copyright, infringement, so to speak, on the Chuck Berry song.
Hmm.
So the sad part is when a shady guy like Morris Levy comes to own song copyrights, he'll wield those copyrights like a bludgeon, right? He'll try to get his pound of flesh out of anyone he can, and that's exactly what he did. And John just wasn't in a position to know better, and it led to almost a 10-year odyssey of litigation with Morris Levy.
It's a fascinating story. There's no doubt about it. And definitely recommend Jay Bergen's book. Have
I,
you?
I I do too. I read Jay's book, and I think mine was already put to bed at the publisher when Jay's book came out. But I read it, and then I've met Jay a few times and talked to him several times. Great guy. I mean, and his book is great, especially for guys like me who are big Beatle fans and lawyers who love to see the detail of how the case unfolded and the litigation strategy and looking at some of the trial transcripts and that kind of thing. I loved it, and I think Jay's a great guy.
Yeah, it covered every angle of that case, and to have word for word what John said in the courtroom.
What a
It's
witness. I can think of as a lawyer how much I'd love to have such an intelligent witness like that, especially the famous line when John shows up on the witness stand with his haircut and he's cross-examined. And isn't it true that you got your hair cut just for this appearance in court? And with only the wit that John Lennon could bring,
uh,
rubbish. I have it cut every 18 months. It was great.
all right. A few other things you cover here. The story on Mal Evans, perfect timing with Ken Womack's book too.
Yeah.
You read
So
that book?
I have read that book and had the great fortune to collaborate a little bit with Ken. He gave me some. His book wasn't out yet, but he was working on it. Again, my book was already put to bed. So
Hmm.
when his book came out and I read it, I had to quickly, gee, I hope everything I said in my book was accurate as Ken, because Ken had access to all the archives. And luckily, everything was accurate. But so I was able to talk with Ken a fair amount. We got together a couple of times before my book came out, and he was very gracious to assist me with some suggestions as I was working on my book. I shared a little bit of my research with him.
Hmm.
The police report, I think, was something he maybe hadn't had yet. So from Mal's unfortunate shooting.
Yeah.
So yeah, but Ken's book, I like to say mine's a mile wide and an inch deep because it covers a lot of subjects in a little bit of detail.
Right.
Uh, Guys like Ken and Mark Lewison, are the true Beatles scholars who just bring amazing research skills and focus on a single subject. Yeah, Ken's book is masterful.
Yeah. The beauty of it all is that not only does he do incredible research, but this is a topic that we've known so little about, Mel Evans. Just like Jim Birkenstead with his book on Jimmy Nicol, who you also have a chapter on here.
That's right. And I referred to that book in my research. And right, I do have a chapter on Jimmy Nicol. And my chapter on Mal Evans was largely not so much about his life, but about his service to the Beatles and
Hmm.
then the unfortunate ending that, that he met, just how sad that whole chapter was, that he was so integral to the Beatles and then how he served them so loyally and then just the way that things ended up for him. So that was more my focus in the chapter. So I dug down in public record searches and Freedom of Information Act stuff and getting the police records and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And there were so many myths, that the police mistook Mal's gun for an air rifle. It wasn't an air rifle, and it was an actual gun that was chambered with ammunition. So just some of these stories on the internet that came out over the decades, getting back to the original sources of these records and really digging down, was revealing, and it didn't take away anything from the tragedy of what happened, but the facts of it were kind of heartbreaking.
Well, once you know the full story about his life in England and his marriage and how that was about to end, and then at the same time trying to maintain some kind of a career on the West Coast in California and trying to balance the two and how he couldn't handle it. It is extremely tragic.
Yeah, he was just star-crossed. I mean, he was so close. He was in such proximity to the brass ring and had talent. I mean, he had a good ear, he could spot talent. He had some production credentials.
Yeah.
He could do these things and he contributed lyrics to Beatles songs and he did these things. I mean, he did them for real, but he just the planets conspired. They aligned in a way that deprived him of really his fair reward for that work. And that's, you know, it's sad and it's such a sad commentary in some ways on the ways that the Beatles kind of manage their business affairs. There was enough to go around, I think, and I think how Mao was treated sort of financially was a sad postscript.
Yeah, I've been fortunate to interview Ken many times, and certainly for this new book, um, on both my podcast shows on Things We Said Today and Talk More Talk. And one of the things that I found so hard to believe was that there were instances where, like when Mal had to go to the Olympia Hotel in Paris, work with the Beatles, and he had to pay for his transportation to get there, when here he is working for them and setting up their equipment, you know, and paying for his hotel as well. I mean, I know the Beatles weren't worldwide famous yet. They were about to be, but you would think that that would be covered under business expenses with NEMS,
Yeah,
things like that. And he had to pay for his flight to India when the Beatles went there. It's
yeah, it is mind-boggling, and there's some evidence that when some of his archives were located, and his widow Lil wanted to auction some of that off, that apparently Paul McCartney sort of stepped in to prevent that from happening,
mm,
claiming that Mal was really only holding some of those papers as part of his job and that they rightfully belonged um, to the Beatles. So, um, you know, yeah, at some points you just scratch your head and say, why couldn't they have just treated Mal a little bit more
mm.
fairly, given him, a little bit of a piece of the pie for everything he did? But Mal, to his credit, just seemed to, although in his diaries there were some to kept him to himself, some complaints and dissatisfaction, loved the Beatles so much and was so willing to serve them
Hmm.
that he sort of subordinated his own disappointment um, to their needs. And it's an amazing tale of a servant leader, you know, for people who are into leadership, that Mao led by being a servant. And it's an amazing story. It's bittersweet.
But the beauty of Ken's book is that it explores everything. One minute, someone like Paul could say something nasty to Mal, and then next thing you know, he asks him to help out with one of his tours, like in '73. Or he asked him for the Wings Over the World or America tour. He wanted him to get involved with that too. So, it's nothing is black and white. You can't just look at one thing that happened, one isolated incident in Beatle history and say, well, that's the way the Beatles treated Mal, because then they could be very nice to them and generous to him in other ways. So,
Right, that's right. And you know, hats off to Ken, because you know, and to Mal's children, because they really wanted the story to be told unvarnished. They
right.
didn't want it to be whitewashed. And I have found, without getting into specifics, that some people in Beatle world do want you to repeat the myths, and you'll get into their good graces if you repeat those myths, but you won't be an accurate reporter of those stories if you buy into some of those myths. So I was very curious to see how Ken's book would come out, being done in so close cooperation with the Evans family. But all of them deserve the undying thanks of Beatle scholars and fans everywhere, because they told the story as it, I mean, just factually, warts and all, and the bad things that, you know, don't paint Mal in a flattering light were included alongside the things that do paint him in a flattering light. It's
Hmm.
balanced, it's honest, it's gut wrenching. So man, did Ken do an amazing job, but he needed, you know, you have to give credit to Gary and Julie as well, because who I have not met. I don't mean to talk about them like they're buddies or anything, but you know, they're mentioned a lot, of course, in the book. You have to give them credit for giving Ken the authority to essentially write their father's story um, as factually as it could be told. So just a great book all around.
Yeah, well, he nailed it,
He
Ken did.
did.
And those interviews I told you about where I interviewed Ken, that those were with Gary as well. So he was great to have
Yeah, I bet.
the shows. All right, so tell folks, I know that your book is available on Amazon, but there are copies that you can purchase that you signed yourself. Again, this is what the front of the book looks like. Fab But True. So how can we get copies, signed copies of the
Yeah,
book?
you can go to fabbuttrue.com, and you can order one there, and you can tell me how you'd like it personalized, and I'll be happy to sign it and get it right out to you. And so fabbuttrue.com, also unsigned copies on Amazon. The Fest for Beatle fans carries it,
Yep.
Barnes and Noble. So a lot of the places where you buy books.
And you will be a guest at the Fest for Beatle fans coming up.
That's the plan.
Yep. As well as Ken Womack, you know. So by all means, stop by and say hello to Doug. And if you can, pick up a copy of the new book, Fab But True. This has been a delight. Thank you so much, Doug, for spending time with us. Continued luck with your book, and I'll see you at the fest.
Thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate you having me on. It's been great.
Okay. Thanks to all of you for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. And we'll see you soon. Take care.